When you buy something new, do you read the owner's manual? Now, I generally don't. I prefer to take it out of the box, start playing with it, I'll figure it out on my own. But for many people, they like to read the owner's manual because it gives them a sense of what they're supposed to do. Now, the irony is that for traditional Jews, the Torah itself is like the owner's manual, but in the opposite direction. You see, it's not like you're the owner and it's directed to you. The owner is still around. That's God. He wrote the manual for your life. And so it's very important to read the manual very, very carefully, because everything you need to know is in there. That's the traditional approach to the Torah. So it makes sense, if there's a manual to life that the owner of the universe has written, that you would read it very carefully, and you would read it regularly. That's why, traditionally, the Torah was divided up into Torah portions, or parshas, as they're often referred to. There are 54 different Torah portions that are read over the course of the 51 weeks in the Jewish calendar. So that means that there are some that are doubled up, and there are also some Torah selections that are special readings for particular holidays. For example, the binding of Isaac is often read on Rosh Hashanah. There is also a 3-year calendar of Torah portions that's out there, but it's based on a much older system and not very commonly used in the Jewish world today. The names of Torah portions are not, they often have nothing to do with the content of the Torah portion. It just happens to be the first word in the section. In our Torah portion today, it does have a lot to do with the content of the chapter, but often it's things like ki tetzeh, when you go out. Well, that doesn't tell you very much, but it's the beginning of that section, so that's what defines it. And we have to remember that it doesn't follow the chapters and verses that we're used to reading in a biblical text, because those were innovations of later centuries, and actually by non-Jews. If you open a Torah scroll itself, you'll see that there are, first of all, no vowels, but secondly, no chapter divisions, no chapter headings. There are clear breaks at the end of Torah readings, and there are clear breaks at the end of books. So the end of the book of Leviticus, the end of the book of Exodus, it's very obvious that something new is starting, but there's no section that defines when chapter 17 ends and chapter 18 begins, because it's a later innovation. Now, for humanistic Jews, the Torah is an interesting challenge, because when you focus so much on the Torah, you've missed a lot in the rest of the Bible, let alone the rest of Jewish literature. You know, if you look at what happens after the Torah in the Bible, you've got the book of Judges and this fascinating cavalcade of personalities who are fighting with each other. It presents a much less coherent and teleological story than you find in the Torah itself. You have the stories of King David and his dramas and his romances and his intrigues. You have the book of Job and his laments. You have the book of Proverbs and its wisdom. You have all these interesting pieces and literature that is ignored, or at least so underutilized that people have spent so much time on the Torah that they miss what's important in the rest of the Bible. As I said, not to mention the rest of Jewish literature, because Jews didn't stop writing when the Torah was completed. Now, the challenge for us is that while we do feel like we're missing out on everything else that's out there, and in fact that may be more inspirational than what we happen to find in a particular week in the Torah portion, you can't understand the rest of Jewish literature without understanding some of the Torah. It's a little bit like knowing the punchline without knowing the joke. You know, to get to the other side doesn't make a lot of sense by itself unless you know about the chicken. So the Torah, in a way, is one of our choices. We can choose to study medieval Jewish literature, modern Jewish literature, modern philosophy, non-Jewish literature. There are plenty of options out there for us. But we can also choose to study this. This is also in our library and an acceptable selection for us to study. In many ways, reading the Torah from a humanistic perspective is a window into historic Jewish practice. You can find out what the people that wrote the text wanted Jews to do. Sometimes you can find out by what they say not to do what Jews were actually doing, because if they're telling them not to do it, they must be doing it. And it's also a window into the people who interpreted the text in a certain time and a certain place for their own setting and what it meant to them. In a way, you're getting into the thought process of reading and interpreting as you're doing it yourself. And that's what makes studying the Torah so fascinating and also so enervating, because there are plenty of times when you read the text and you say, well, that interpreter was wrong because he wasn't thinking historically. Or you'll say that that interpreter was crazy because he assumed it meant this and I think it means something else. Or you might say, that original text is terrible. How could it present that as a positive value? And that's okay, because you have to define yourself both in connection with your past and also in disjunction with your Many of us have undergone the experience of what's called individuation, where you grow up as a child in a household and you need to find a way to separate yourself from who your parents are and who they want you to be. And that process can be smooth and it can be rocky, and sometimes it can be very radical and it can be a very strong break. But that process of individuation is also a process of self-definition, where you say, I like this piece that they did and I want to keep that in my family, and I don't like these other things that they did and I don't want to do that. I've had the experience myself, being a parent, that I hear things coming out of my mouth and I say, oh no. That's exactly the way my parents used to say it, and I didn't like that, so let me try and fix it. But there are other times I hear them coming out of my mouth and I think, wow, they were right. I never realized it before now. The most important reason why it's important for humanistic Jews to look at the Torah, if only from time to time, is that it gives us a common discussion point with other Jews. We can have a much more detailed answer than, feh, I don't like it. We can show that we know something about Jewish history and Jewish culture, and we can use this as the starting point for a discussion of a whole other range of ideas and issues in connection with Jewish life and our philosophy.